but it's based on information on the media or just testimonies for some people, okay? But the rest of the society is not a direct witness or a victim of the violence. So we need to build this idea of what happened to that group. And for all this is that we work we process the memory of the group that suffered violence. We're going to see in a moment how to do it, because it's not easy. For sure, these people is not going to agree all the time of what happened to them. Some people consider could consider that what happened to them is state violence. Other parts say, other portion of the society, of this group say, well, it's not the state violence, it's just a self-defense group, violence, or it's a guerrilla group violence, okay? So we're going to have different perception within the group that make the building of the memory a different process, a difficult process. So again, just to summarize this slide, so history is factual, is based on contrast of sources, primary sources or secondary sources. Okay? And oral history, that is very related with memory, is a process to track facts through interviews and direct witness perceptions. Okay. Now, in this slide, what you're going to see is that, again, it is very important to remember, to keep in mind that memory and remembering is not the same in this social process. When we say historical memory, we are always referring to a collective process. It is not individual. What happened to one person in a conflict is just an experience, but to include that experience in the construction of memory needs to be integrated in a collective process. If it is not collective, it's not memory in terms of this kind of new discipline of memory, okay? If it is individual, it's just an experience or remembering. The thing is, if it is an experience, it's not less or more than the memory, it's just different, okay? But it's not, we cannot say that one person built memory in a conflict or in a post-conflict in a society. So it is all the time a collective process, let's say, reflecting the experience of social unrest, conflicts, wars, and violence. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the big question is how to collect memory, how to manage, okay, these memories, if we talk in plural, because if we have, like in Colombia, not only one group suffering a violence experience, but different groups suffering through many years, decades of violence, we're going to have not only a memory, a collective memory, okay, but we're going to have memories in plural, okay, and we're going to need to contrast these memories. So how to collect it? So what we do in the National Center of Historical Memory is to use different professionals, so psychologists, historians, attorneys, social workers, journalists, are some of them, okay? These professionals here, this is, for example, a picture of the Diane H's journalist interviewing someone from a community that suffered violence, okay? A victim of the conflict in Colombia. So eventually, just one interview or one picture or one object that reflects memory, it is not enough to say that we are collecting memory, because memory is collective, Okay, so memory is a little bit like the human rights archives. One page, well, it's not an archive, it's just one page, okay? 100 pages is not an archive, it's just maybe a book, okay? But then if we collect and collect and collect, at some point, the amount of information may, let's say, this to be important. So that happened in this collection of historical memory. When the National Center started in 2011, the process was very embryonic. I mean, it was just a couple of testimonies, very important, very sensitive, but not yet, let's say, a memory process. But 10 years later, 9 years later, right now, the amount of testimonies, the amount of objects, the amount of information we have about the conflict make possible to Colombia to say that we already have a strong memory process in the country. Okay? Not all the countries that suffer violence are able to say the same. Okay? Sometimes it's very difficult for some countries to process their experience. We're going to see a couple of examples in a moment. Another element to the how to collect memory is this, what we are doing right now this afternoon. That I'm sharing with you that the experience of one person or of a community, it is important for the whole society. I mean, for everyone. Okay, when let's say, for example, this woman in her interview tell how she lost her 3 children, how they were killed, okay? How the remains of the corpses were returned to her. So this is strong for us as a society, but it's necessary in a way for us to understand that we as a society suffer in a conflict. If we just avoid the conflict all the time, change the channel in the news, or just try to live our lives like there is no conflict in Colombia, so we are lost because we're supposed to repeat this history all the time, okay? So, let's say sensitization through symbolism is one of the let's say, goals of the museum, as we're going to mention, okay? And another element that is quite important in this memory process in Colombia, and the museum and the National Center is working on this, is the cultural production. So, at the beginning, normally victims present their stories in a direct way, in a very strong, let's say, how to express it? Yeah, in a strong way. Just they pass all the information to the professionals that they were working with them. Then, little by little, let's say, to pass all this suffering information from a person to another, it is not enough for that person to heal. It is not enough for symbolic reparation. It is not enough to overpass this suffering. So what we intend to do in the museum is to start a cultural production. So we start workshops on literature, visual arts, and music. So the victims of the conflict start to write down tales, stories, not necessarily their stories, but in the creation of these stories, they try to reflect their experience in the conflict. The same for the people who paint or make sculptures, or for the people who compose the lyrics of songs. So, for example, in Bohaja, I imagine you know that there is a kind of religious song called Alawao. So for a long time, the Alabao songs were extremely religious, but after the massacre in Bohaja, the lyrics change, and people, especially women, start to write down their experience of how people die in the church, and how was the process, the social process, to feel that not even a church was a safe place for the community, that they start to, let's say, heal as a society and overpass the traumatic experience that was the massacre. Most of the cultural production is now being collected by the museum, and we hope that in 2021, when we open our doors, most of this cultural production is going to be displayed for the people who just go and look and try to understand what happened to the communities. There are some examples here in this slide of how people try to express through cultural production their memory, the collective memory. So photography, family albums, paintings, collective workshops, all of these are ways of how to, people try to overpass the traumatic experience that they suffered during the conflict. Eventually, it is quite obvious. I mean, you don't have to say that all the cultural production or artistic production of memory is beautiful. I mean, some items are quite ugly. I mean, this is quite obvious, okay? We are not actually producing this because it is extremely beautiful. It is because it is symbolic. It is what it is behind this cultural production, what is behind this music, this visual art, or this literature or writing. Good. So here we have some examples. Colombia is not the only country working on memory issues. We have a long history of memory places and museums, especially. Why? Because memory is related with violence, and violence is everywhere. So let's going to take some regional examples. Here, we in the museum, Memory Museum of Colombia, we're working together with some of these museums. Okay, one of our closest partners is the Museum of Memory and Human Rights of Chile, that now it is quite, the country is in a social unrest right now. As you know, in Chile, it was a dictatorship, and some people was prosecuted by the state. It's a kind of different violence than in Colombia, because it's a kind of state systematic violence. But then, once they overpass this violence, they decide to build up this museum to remember what happened, how it is important for people to just, let's say, call the attention when they feel their civil rights and liberties are not respected by the authorities. In Argentina, we have ESMA, the Space of Memory and Human Rights. I visited these museums 2 weeks ago. These museums are very disturbing. I normally feel that when societies build up museums in the same place that the human rights violations happened, it is very strong. I mean, if you go to concentration camps, that some of them are right now museums, I think you can feel the energy of the suffering in that process. Well, in the case in Colombia, we are not building our museum in the same place of the human rights violations happen. So I imagine my office is not going to be with that strong energy all the time. But some states decide to do so. Okay, so that's the case for them, and that works for them. And it's important because they try to pass the information to the next generations that when human rights violations happens, we need to do something. It is not to change the channel or just to take distance. Would that concern us, you know, for let's say concern the whole society, not just a group of victims. Well, we have also the Apartheid Museum in South Africa, Sierra Leone, Hiroshima, have the Peace Memorial Museum in Japan. One museum, this picture over here, is the Yad Vashem Museum, Holocaust Museum in Israel. That is one of the biggest and most important museums of the Holocaust in the world. We have another in Washington, another in Berlin, okay? And you can see all the pictures of the people that they can identify that die in the Holocaust. And that's the case. In Colombia, we have, at the end of the list, there is the House of Memory Museum in Medellin, okay? We have some small museums in some regions of the country. But the project we're going to present you now is the first national project in memory issues. So this is a render of how it's going to be our National Museum of Memory, okay? The Museum of Memory of Colombia. It's going to be here in Bogota. It's going to be next to I'm going to show you a map in a moment. It's going to be in front of the Bogota Council, and it is a long process, and actually a difficult process to the politicians and different governments to decide we are going to have a museum to remember the victims of the conflict. So I'm going to pass very fast through this slide because this is a legal framework of the museum. So first we have a law from 2011, and the law established that we need measure of satisfaction that implies dignity and truth. Then we need symbolic reparation. I don't know if you know the difference between symbolic reparation and material reparation. I think it's from the denomination. It's very easy to understand that when we suffer a damage, the material reparation is that we are going to be paid for the same object we lose. But when our damage is not material, when it is psychological or symbolic, sometimes we cannot be repaired by just money or objects. We need to be repaired through symbolism. I have an example for this that I think everybody can understand very easy. I imagine most of you have been in a relationship, maybe in a couple relationship or threesome relationship or whatever. So in this kind of relationship, okay, maybe you can suffer, let's say your couple decide to go with someone else, okay? So your heart is broken, okay? And then your couple decide to return and ask, forgiveness and come back to you and say, I was mistaken, that person is an asshole or whatever, and I want to continue my history with you. So what this person has to do to be accepted again? You suffer damage because I'm assuming that you suffer when that person decide to go with someone else. I'm broken. So for sure, the less you're expecting is an apology. That's the less. That's the baseline. Okay, that's a way of reparation. Okay, it could be, a kind of symbolic reparation. If it's a special dinner with flowers or chocolates or music, okay? Let's say you prefer, let's say your pink world reconciliation. That's a way of symbolism and symbolic reparation. So if the person, on the other hand, if the person come back to you and say, well, I want to come back to you. I know I just inflict to you some damage, but I'm going to pay you. Please tell me how much is your damage and I'm going to pay you, and then we're just going to continue our history together. Well, that's not, I mean, maybe some people would accept, but let's say that's not the normal process, okay? So it is the same for the people who suffer in violence. They need to know, I mean, let's going to put, let's say, serious example. The woman that I mentioned that lose her 3 children, she needs to know what happened to them. Okay, or if you have your father, mother, sister, brother just disappear, I mean, one step to symbolic reparation, to overpass the conflict, is to know what happened with that person. Okay, so that is true. Okay, the truth is this truth is very important in the process of symbolic reparation. Okay, so the law also implies that we're going to have a human rights and historical memory archive. This archive is in the process to be achieved. And we have the National Center, and then we have the museum, okay? For the museum, we have another article in a decree that say that the private sector, the civil society, the international and state cooperation is needed. In other words, everyone has to need, I mean, everyone needs to be involved all the time, okay? Good, so how we're going to build the museum? So we, from 2012 to 2016, we start a participation strategy of meetings, workshops, seminars through Colombia, okay, to different far away places that I don't even know the name when I arrive to the museum. For example, I don't know if someone knows where is Jurumangui. Well, it's a place that suffered a lot during the conflict. So these kind of places that are not the main cities were consulted. I mean, we developed meetings, workshops in these places. Jurumangui, by the way, is 3 hours in a boat from Buenaventura. Okay, so it is quite far. Then we start to ask people to record testimonials and take pictures to collect all this information from the society. Then we have some process, as it is in the slide. We have some open call initiatives. Then we have also a project on art and conflict that people can offer their artistic work to the museum, because we cannot pay, okay, at the museum for art work. And then also we are working in Colombia with this kind of differential approach. Differential approach is working with different kind of groups. So indigenous people, Rome, Black communities, some women communities, and eventually sexual minorities. Actually, we already in the center realized that sexual minorities are not minorities anymore. And we try to express how all these different groups suffer the conflict. It's not the same when you are homosexual and suffer the conflict in a region, and when you are an indigenous person in another region of the conflict, okay? So So in the National Center, we have 3 publications, I think you already know that, that are very serious research on this differential approach, okay, these differential groups. And then after this social working, we start to work with different local museums or places of memory. The Museum of Memory is an initiative from the government of Colombia, but not all the museums of memory or all the memory places are governmental. Some of them are of private initiative. And all these points in the map reflect some memory places that the community decide to build. In places where they suffered the conflict, in places where a lot of people were killed or kidnapped or some atrocities of the war happened. We are trying to work with them because obviously if the initiative is private, normally they don't have money to run the place, okay? Because, I mean, if I ask how many of you have, let's say, give money to a memory place, I assume that none of you, because we normally don't give money for this kind of cause, okay? We normally help for other kind of causes, you know, that are important as well, like animal protection, children protection, or differential approaches. But if we ask people to help to support memory places, some people would say, what is memory and what is important? Okay. But right now we are trying to give these places resources to continue working. Well, here is the map. We're going to be, we're building in Bogota this kind of memory and peace urban axis when it is the center of memory and reconciliation of the city. Is going to be also the Museum of Memory. It's going to be in the 26th Street. So that's where it's going to be placed. How we arrive to how the museum is going to be designed, we have a design competition between architect firms around the world. 92 proposals were received, and finally, a Colombian firm in association with a Spanish firm get the grant to design the building. We're going to have 5 exhibition rooms of 500 square meters. We're going to have a documentation center of human rights, archive for research, especially for university students. We're going to be places for the workshops with victims, commercial spaces, an auditorium, you know, a public space, well, different kind of rooms, and a morning place, which is this kind of trying to continue the process as a society to overpass the suffering of the conflict. How we are going to build the museum? Well, we're going to work with international cooperation. The museum is quite expensive. Actually, it's expensive right now. But a lot of countries that already passed through violence experience want to help Colombia in this process. So we are getting cooperation, both technical cooperation and financial cooperation from countries like Peru, Argentina, United States, Switzerland, Sweden, China. Well, China is going to support us, support the museum in terms of technology. Okay. Also, we're trying to build government relationships. It is very important to understand that memory is especially focused on the victims of the conflict. Okay, so if we are not victims, we are going to be public of the museum, and we are going to support the victims. But eventually, all the work of the museum and the National Center is for the victims. Now, victims can be mainly civil society, but not all the time that's the case. We can have victims of the military forces as well, okay? If they are not fighting, okay, for example, if a soldier is in a day off, okay, with his family, and he's kidnapped, well, he's a victim of the conflict. That day, he was not fighting, he was not a combatant in terms of international humanitarian law, okay? The same for someone being part of an illegal group, okay? Some children were, let's say, included in this illegal groups for when they were, let's say, when they were not big enough to take their own decisions. Okay, this kind of reach of being adult or just a teenager maybe is not the best example to just put a line where you're able to take your own decisions or not. So some members of illegal groups can be victims in this conflict. Okay. So the idea of the museum is to present to the people that we have victims for not only the civil society, but from different kinds of groups. That if we continue putting label on the front of the people, saying these are the bad people, okay, and this is the good people, where we're not going to overpass the conflict. Okay? If we classify the people all the time in evil and good, the process is going to be impossible. And I mentioned this because in the center and the museum, normally we ask all the time if the museum is going to be for the FARC, or it's going to be for the soldiers, or it's going to be for the self-defense groups, or it's going to be for who is going to be the museum? Okay, and the answer is it's going to be for the victims, all of them. It doesn't matter if it was in legal terms, if the person was criminal or not. For the museum is irrelevant. Okay, for us, what is important is if the people are victims. And the definition of victim is right now in Colombia in the law. Okay, so we are not going to enter into the subjective definition, who is a victim and who is not, because already the legal system of Colombia defines what is a victim. So this is another slide that shows, or try to show, how the building of the museum is going to be. So this is obviously the 26th Street, downtown, and this is going to be the museum. Some people say it's horrible, some people say it's beautiful, and that's Colombia. I mean, different kinds of opinions all the time. We are rich in debate, actually. Okay? We have difficulties to agree most of the time. So the museum is a place to dialogue and discuss and show and reflect our differences, but not to kill each other, but through speaking to each other, dialogue to each other all the time. So in general, that was my presentation to you. I don't know if you have questions, comments, or something that is not maybe clear, or something that you listen in the media that you want to clarify about the National Center or the Museum of Memory.
Well, thank you so much for this speech, and giving us the opportunity to know more about this conflict that people here in the city, we are very apart from. And we say all the time that we are suffering, that our country is horrible, but we have never lived conflict and violence at all. And I think that these spaces are very important to know what is going on and to make visible these kind of different conflicts and different victims. My question is, if this Center of Historical Memory, it's an initiative from the current government, or when did it start? Because I saw that the law, it says 2011, so we didn't have Duque in the government. And I don't know if it's part of the process of peace that Santos left in his government. I just want to know that. And it seems, and the other thing is how you are going to spread the centers of memory in different parts which are not accessible, or they are difficult to access. For example, in the map that you showed us, the Cauca, it's a very complicated zone for conflict, and they don't have these kind of places to show what is going on. And it's the same as Bichada and in the eastern part of the country. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So the first question, well, the both questions are important, but let's say the first question is, memory and the conflict in all the countries that suffer violence needs to be a policy of the state, not a policy of government. If we, actually that should be a good idea for a lot of policy, including education. Education should be a policy of the state, a state policy, you know, some baseline for the education, or the culture, or the memory. And the idea of an intelligent state, an intelligent society, is not to change some topics when change the government, okay? So, memory is a good example because, as you mentioned, as you saw correctly, the law is from 2011. So at that time, the peace process was not, was a kind of option, but was far from being reached. And the center, the National Center of Memory, was created in 2011. And then the activities of the museum started in 2012. So through the different governments since then, we continue working. Obviously, the staff changed sometimes. Part of the staff changed when government changed. But something that we could be proud of is that we have a kind of policy. We still have a long way to go, but for now we have a state policy of memory that doesn't change when government change, okay? Because that's very Latin America. This idea that everything needs to be changed when a government change is to be, let's say, walking in round and round in a kind of round way in the undeveloped process of society building. So the process is going to be long. We still need a long way to go because the museum is going to be at the end of this government, but for sure it's going to be the next government who is going to change the exhibitions, because the exhibitions of the museum needs to change. We have a lot of information to present. The museum is not going to be this 19th century idea of museum, of art or history museum, where everything is static, okay? And this is an object of the museum and nobody can touch it. The museum today, the idea of a museum today is more interactive. You're supposed to, and that's the reason why China is going to help us with technology, because technology is going to be very important at the museum. And people that is blind needs to be, that actually are victims of the conflict, some of them, needs to go to the museum and touch and identify the elements of the museum. So it's going to be it is not to be the traditional museum that we maybe could consider. And then the second question was about the work with in the regions, that what we call at the museum as territorialization of the museum. Well, Cauca, for example, is about to open a museum, the House of the Memories in Cali is going to try to collect, all the information that all this population suffer in the region. In Valle, I mean. And in Cauca, we also have some initiatives. In the map is from last year, so in this year we already have some additional initiatives. So Villavicencio, for example, is going to build its own memorial. And the south of the country, that actually is a place when the conflict happened, in an important way, let's say, is going to build up some other places. Okay. Good. Another question, comment? Yes. Micro over here.
Well, I would like to know the challenges and limitations for creating this project, or any challenges that you have faced during the development of this museum.
Yeah, that's a very good question as well, because everything sounds quite nice. I mean, everything sounds like we are a good society, we understand, or we're trying to understand our conflict, and we're going to build a museum, we're going to honor the victims and try to make symbolic reparation. That's all very civilized. So we look like, I don't know, maybe a kind of British society, everything is perfect. But actually it is not. The thing is, one difficulty was, the first challenge was the victims to trust the state, to give their testimonies to the state. So the question is, if I, just going to bring an example, if I suffer because I consider the state attacked me, that's an option. Another option is the state didn't protect me. That's another, the two options in general. Well, the question is why I have to cooperate with the state, given information about my experience, my personal experience, including, for example, sexual violence, something that is very private, to be displayed for everybody. So everybody is going to know that I suffer sexual violence. So that was a challenge. So to give the people, warranties on this process and say, well, trust us and tell your story and share with us your documents, your photographs, your archives, okay? That challenge was more or less overpassed, okay, in the first years. Now, as the previous questions, when government change, there is always a challenge for this kind of process, okay? Because memory is related, it is not the same of history, but it's related to history. And obviously governments and politicians in general want to tell a version of history, of their history, that maybe put them in a good position. And that is not easy, okay? Actually, I'm telling this to you, in this moment, because we are in a university. An academy is the perfect place to discuss and debate. But if this were a meeting in the Office of Public Function, I prefer not to say this, okay? So that's another challenge. And then a third final challenge is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a monster in Colombia. Everything needs to be on paper. Everything needs to be signed for 12 people. And these 12 people need to have everyone 1 or 2 secretaries to check. And then if someone misspell, just a letter, the whole process needs to be repeated. So when we at the museum say that a document needs to be signed by the high government, we say like, oh my God, there is not another option, because indeed it's going to take for months. So that's the main 3 challenges that we have. Well, actually, we are now facing another challenge, and it's polarization. This idea, that people is very much on the extremes of the politics, left-wing or right-wing politics, but very extreme. This idea, if you are in the right wing, everything that is social reivindication is just so lefty and so hippie and just bad smell, and I don't want to know about it. And the other way, if you are in the left and someone say, let's going to include victims from illegal, from the state, for the military forces. People say no, they are not humans. I say no, they are. So this polarization of the political debate in Colombia is affecting us. Actually, it is making the museum and the center losing the possibility to get more and more resources. Because when we present this polarization of political debate in the media, internationally, some states and some corporates prefer not to invest in the peace process in Colombia. They say they are not ready for peace process. They are so extremist. And we cannot put money in Colombia yet. So some cooperation initiatives were withdrawn from the museum and the center. Okay? So when people just stand in these extreme political positions, they don't realize how much damage they can do to the victims, to the society, and to the building of a better, let's say, reparation and symbolic process that try to overpass the conflict that a lot of people suffer. And as one person just mentioned, we in the cities, some people suffer some kind of violence, extortion or kidnapping, but the force and the degradation of violence in some regions of the country are incredible. I don't want to just to present information that could be very traumatic, so I'm going just to pick something more or less soft of this year. In Villavicencio we present a contemporary dance performance, and the dance was about the mothers that lose their children in the conflict. And then at the end of the performance, a woman just approached me, and well, I was with the group of the museum. She was crying. A lot of people cry in this kind of performance. That's more or less natural, so I just cope with that. But then she said, I just want to thank you, because I feel that the pain I suffer when I lose my daughter is easier when I just share with more people how I lose it. So I said, oh, how cute. How you lose your daughter? That was a bad question. The daughter was kidnapped, was raped by a group of people, was decapitated. The group that decapitated just played football, soccer with the head, filmed and returned the head to the mother. I was I mean, and she just told me as it was natural, and I couldn't speak for the next 2 days. It was so strong, and just receiving, I mean, you're receiving from me, I didn't suffer that. I was receiving the information from the person who suffered, and that's many times stronger. So, and in this kind of experience, I have more testimonies like that. But again, I just try to choose just one experience that was not extremely strong. Okay, so you can imagine the rest of the stories. So again, when people stand in these extreme political positions, they don't realize to whom they are attacking. Okay, to this person. When they say, well, they're in the countryside, they are all on one side or the other, or we are, as I mentioned before, we are very fast to put in labels in the front of the people. I mean, they are good or bad, or evil, or part of a group, whatever the group is, and we are extremely fast, and we are managed a little bit by the media in this kind of classifying people in black and white. But the truth is that life is gray. I mean, some people that maybe kill someone do it because at the same time, when he was a child, he lost his father and mother by the other group in the conflict. So all this is what we try to present at the museum. Okay, so the museum is a very interesting project. Put Colombia in the same level of developing countries or developed countries as well, like Germany, or in the case of Chile, Argentina, that really want to present to the next generation what happened in the conflict and how it is important to know and try to overpass. Okay. Any other question, comment? I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tamayo. We wanted just to, okay, these presentations we planned were, our interest was to help our students feel part of our country, this process our country is living, and try to help also institutions like yours, which really help us grow as human beings. Right? So we would like to know maybe if you could give us some pieces of advice regarding how we as a university and how our students as future teachers can help with the mission and the purpose of your institution.
Yeah, for sure. That's quite good. At the museum, I'm going to be very brief in this because, as I mentioned, well, being a political extremist, I mean, being an extremist, not only in politics, but in the life, is just a mistake, okay? So try to be critics and try to analyze the information you receive from the media or from political parties or from any institution. It's just one advice that we just want to pass to all the visitors of the museum. We really want people to be sensible to the other, okay? We in Colombia, we say that we are very friendly and we help each other and whatever, but my perception, indeed, is a little bit different. I think we care very few for other people, okay? We are very selfish in a way. We still have a process to really care and be more empathic with the suffering of other people. If someone fail an exam, I don't care because I just pass. Okay. Well, eventually I don't need to cry if I pass and someone fail. But for sure, try to be more empathic. Try to be more to put yourself, you know, in the shoes of someone else. It's just something that we need as society. And when I just use, for example, public transportation, I realize that when we are pushed a little bit, we are like animals. I mean, we just try to survive all the time. I mean, we don't care if we need to just pass over someone else. I mean, just we do it all the time. So one recommendation is when you have in the future students, try to teach your students. And bullying is an example. I mean, this idea of not doing bullying in high school or et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's a reflection of how we are not able yet to teach our younger generation of being of care for each other. Okay, so this is someone that I really recommend you. And in my 15 years as a professor, I never had a fight with a student. I have some professors that actually fight. Well, first verbally, and then in a couple of cases physically with the students. That's not my case. And actually, when students go to my office, I normally assume that they are going to talk about academic stuff. But in 50% of the cases, they talk about personal stuff. They approach to me and tell me they are heartbroken or have a problem in the family and these kind of things. And some of my colleagues say, you're just losing your time. I mean, you have a lot of things to do. Why you listen all these stories? They're just so, child in mind, and that stories are not important. But my perception is different. My perception is what happens to someone else, and especially when it's my student, it is important. So I try to be as empathic as I can, and I try to pass to other people this kind of empathy as an important value. And in the museum, that's a key rule. And finally, I say that I was short, but I'm not. And finally, something else is try to keep our hope. Our history in Colombia is strong. It's difficult. A lot of people suffer. We have a high, figures and numbers in different kinds of violence, in kidnapping, massacres, etc., etc. But we need to try to believe that we are a society that is going to be able to be in peace. How wonderful would be that nobody in the street is going to be so worried that someone is going to just take your cell phone from you, with some kind of violence. Or how wonderful would be if people can walk late in the night and is not worried about sexual assault. That would be, and there are countries in which that happens, so it is possible. So we really need to convince ourselves that we are also able to reach that point.
Well, guys, we have reached the end of our presentation today. Thank you again, Mr. Tamayo. It has been a nice experience having your presentations. So we really hope you have made the most of these two talks that we have had so far. I don't know, maybe we're going to have a third one, but it is not like for sure we're going to have it this semester. Meanwhile, we want you to keep in mind all these ideas as future teachers, because this is going to be part of your reality, right? Not only, I suppose that not all of you are going to work at universities, institutions, some of you are going to work at schools too, and you're going to help a generation grow. And anyways, look at what Mr. Tamayo said. As a professor, he has had the experience to, listen to his students and see to what extent they are human beings that need to be heard. So try to think of that, try to think of your mission as future teachers, and try to make the most of all these professional, let's say, these talks that can help you grow as professionals better. Well, guys, so thank you very much. Again, I would like to ask you two for applause for our presenter. ask you to help us with another activity that we're going to have after this one. Remember that we have the week of health. Can we translate it like that? So from Bienestar Universitario, we're going to have some activities in front of Fundadores building, is it?
No, it's in front of building 5.
Okay, so exactly, so like this. Exactly, like in the center of the university, we're gonna have some activities. You're gonna go with the teachers. You have class with. So the idea is to go have some moments with your partners and develop some activities. And afterwards, you're gonna have your class. We're gonna spend like 20 minutes doing this activity, and then you go to class. So please meet your teachers. Teachers you have at 5:40, and then we're gonna continue our normal classes, right? Thank you for your attention. See you around.